Greetings to Suwahi. So as for today, I'm going to present my presentation on research method, which is entitled Saving Investment Gap and the Economic Growth that occur from 2010 until 2018 in 30 developing countries. Start off with the introduction, which is the definition of saving gaps is where a situation where the existing level of saving is insufficient to achieve an economic objective. In other developed economies, a saving gap refers to the gap between current saving for retirement and that necessary to generate a desirable income from retirement. It is where in less developed economies, saving gaps commonly refers to the deficit between current aggregate saving and the level of savings that are required to provide funds for the business investment. It is where this type of saving gap is also called as a saving investment gap, which is the phenomenon of a country experiencing a saving investment gap that is a common problem in many countries in the world. At other times, countries might be able to meet the investment needs of domestic saving that also has the possibility of domestic saving that cannot meet the needs of investment or the saving investment gap. Next, moving forward to the problem statement, which I want to find out the relationship among the independent variable with the saving investment gap as the dependent variable, which is included a 5 variable. Next up, the problem statement is which developing countries need to be close financing gap in investment, R&D, and innovation with their domestic saving. Thirdly, the certain countries unable to cope between saving investment gaps and the economic growth, as it is also include the demographic and economic instability. Next up is the research objective. Why? Is where it's related that I want to seek out the solution for the question whether it is true that they have a positive relationship between the saving investment gap and the economic of saving by generalizing the result using the data given of the 5 variables that have been chosen, which is the gross domestic product, gross national saving, unemployment rate, inflation rate, and also the current account balance. Second objective is where to observe and see the comparison on the effect of the long term and short term of the process within those years, whether it shows an improvement on the GDP or the opposite. Third is where to seek out where other factors like invest resources, limitations, economic development in certain countries of developing countries also giving impact toward the saving investment gap and also the economic growth. Next up, to narrow the gap of the saving investment gap, statistical significant evidence, which is using principal component regression that I've been using it to find in the finding later, that has suggested focusing on income and demographic variables while if the objective is to widen the gap. Moving forward to the discussion, the data shown above is where the descriptive statistic that has been generated that occur from 2010 till 2018, which is selected in 30 of developing countries. The descriptive statistic clarify that the sample that need to be simplified and characterized with 9 years observation. It shows an prevalent overview of the descriptive data such as the mean, median, skewness, and so on. When the skewness are ranged between 0.5 to 1 or more than 1, or range 0.5 to -1, that is moderate skewness. So based on the table, it could be seen that all the variables are in the moderate skewness. Take a look at the kurtosis is when the value is equal to 0, that is normal distribute. However, if it is more than 0, then it is positive kurtosis, such as the GDP, IR, UR, which is the unemployment rate, and also the CAB, which is current account balance. Meanwhile, the variables that gets negative is where the SIG, which is saving investment gap, and also the GNS, which is gross national saving. Now is the estimation and interpretation of the model. From the table above that has been generated using EView7, I could find that the R-square is 0.352044, meaning that is 35% of the dependent variables is not affected by the independent variables, while other 64.80% is affected by the external factor. Next, the adjusted R-square, which is 0.72788, meaning that 72.79% of dependent variable is affected by the independent variables, while 27.21% was affected by the external factor that is adjusted by the degree of freedom. So, discussion related to the research objective that I have found from the data that been generated in the EViews is where based on the research objective 1, it is in order to identify the relationship between the gross domestic product on saving investment gap and the economic growth in developing countries. So by that, the hypothesis 1, which is the null hypothesis, the gross domestic product GDP has no relationship on saving investment gap and the economic growth in the developing countries. However, the H1 is the gross domestic product GDP has the relationship on saving investment gap and the economic growth in the developing countries. As for the research objective number 2, which is in order to identify the relationship between the gross national saving and saving investment gap and economic growth in the developing countries. So based on the OLS, when the saving investment gap has increases by 1%, the gross national saving in the selected developing countries has decreased by 0.1945%, and the p-value, which is 0.042, that is lower than the significant level 0.05. Hence, we reject the null hypothesis. Overall, there is a relationship between the gross national saving on saving investment gap and the economic growth in developing countries. So this is the hypothesis discussion that related to the research objective. So for the hypothesis, we can see that the null hypothesis based on the OLS, when the saving investment gap has increases by Rm1 ringgit, the gross domestic product in the selected developing countries has increased by Rm2.16, which means that the p-value, which is 0.6061, that is higher than the significant level of 0.05. Hence, we do not reject the null hypothesis. Overall, there is no relationship between the gross domestic on saving investment gap and economic growth in developing countries. So now moving forward to research objective number 2, which is the identify the relationship between the gross national saving on saving investment gap and economic growth in developing countries. We have based on the OLS, it is detected that when the saving investment gap has increases by 1%, the gross national saving in the selected developing countries has decreased by 0.1945%, and the p-value, which is 0.042, that is lower than the significant level of 0.05. Hence, we reject the null hypothesis. Overall, There is a relationship between the gross domestic on saving investment gap and the economic growth in developing countries. Moving forward to the research objective of number 3, it is to which is in order to identify the relationship between the inflation rate on saving investment gap and the economic growth in the developing countries, which is saying that when the saving investment gap has increases by 1%, the inflation rate in the selected developing countries has increased by 0.175%, and the p-value, which is occur at 0.014, that is lower than the significant level of 0.05, which can be seen on the table previously. Hence, reject the null hypothesis. Overall, there is a relationship between inflation rate on saving investment gap and economic growth in the developing countries. Research objective 4, that is identify the relationship between the unemployment rate on saving investment gap and the economic growth in developing countries. Based on our OLS, when the saving investment gap has increases by 1%, the unemployment rate in the selected developing countries has decreased by negative 2.935%, and the p-value, that is 0.026, that is lower than the significant level of 0.05. Hence, we reject the null hypothesis. Overall, there is a relationship between inflation rate on saving investment gap and the economic growth in developing countries. The last but not least, the research objective 5, which is to identify the relationship between the current account balance on saving investment gap and economic growth in the developing countries. Is when the saving investment gap has increases by 1%, the current account balance is in the selected developing countries has decreased by the negative 0.3459%, but the p-value, which is 0.6731, that is more than the significant level of 0.05, as we can see the result. Hence, we do not reject the null hypothesis. Overall, there is no relationship between inflation rate on saving investment gap and economic growth in developing countries. And these are the ANOVA, which is analysis of variance in a statistical technique that is used to check if the means of two or more groups are significantly different from each other. From the data, it can be seen that the F value is greater than the F critical value for the alpha level selected, which is 0.05. Therefore, this means that the 5 variables are not all equal on saving investment gap and the economic growth in the developing countries. Next is the diagnostic checking of multicollinearity. The table that generated from AVS above shows that the BIF values of independent variables. There is multicollinearity among the variables as the variable BIF is more than 10, as stated by the Giuretti and the Porter, is where which the GDP, UR, and CAB. This means that the null hypothesis is rejected since only 2 of the variables is less than 10. Therefore, there is multicollinearity in the model. For the autocorrelation, from the result of OIS regression, it can be identified that there are autocorrelation problem based on Durbin-Watson statistic. The hypothesis is shown as below. So by confirming it, Bruce-Godfrey serial correlation LM tests are used. The result is shown as below. The result of Bruce-Godfrey shows that the p-value is 0.289, means that is more than the significant level of 0.05 by 2 lag. Therefore, We do not reject the null hypothesis, and result confirm that it doesn't have the autocorrelation problem of the 5 variables that I have been chosen. So as for discussion of major result, this is the regression analysis. So this is the overall result that can be seen clearly of the result that has been come out. So the dependent variables which is the saving investment gap, and the independent variable which is the gross domestic product, the gross national saving, inflation rate, unemployment rate, and the current account balance. It has been expected the sign of this study, which shows that the CIG and GDP having a negative, which is there is no relationship between these two variables. For the saving investment gap and GNS, it shows the positive where they have a relationship between these two variables. For the inflation rate, it shows positive and it has a relationship. Same goes to the saving investment gap and the unemployment rate, which it has the positive signs of this study and it has a relationship. However, for saving investment gap and current account balance, it shows that there doesn't have relationship, which shows the sign of negative.
So as for the conclusion and also the recommendation, the project has succeeded one of its objectives, which is figure out the solution for the questions whether it is true that there is a positive relationship between the saving investment gap and also the economic growth of saving by generalizing the result using the data given based on the objective above. So, and based on the objective, it's resulting that it has a positive relationship between the 3 variables only, which is the gross national saving, inflation rate, and unemployment rate that affect the saving investment gap. For the conclusion of the second objective, the project has not succeeded its objective, which is observe and see the comparison of the effects of the long term and short term of the process within those years, whether it shows improvement on GDP or the opposite within those years. So the reason is because that it has the resulting negative relationship. This can be explained as the fact that saving is one of the main factors to the economy growth is still unconscionable. So we will move forward to the conclusion of the third objective. The project has succeeded its objective, which is seek out where other factors like invest resources, limitations, economic development in certain countries of developing countries also give impact to its saving investment gap and the economic growth. And the reason is because the accumulated saving can be considered as the sources of the capital stock, to which play a crucial role in creating investment production and employment. Hence, all these activities eventually enhance economic growth of the economy that would contribute to a growth in a personal income and per capita of the consumption expenditure. So lastly, as for the conclusion of the fourth objective, the project has succeeded its objective, which is the narrow the gap of saving investment gap statistical significant using principal component regression that suggests focusing on income and demographic variables, while if the objective is to widen the gap. And the reason is because the variables like gross national saving, unemployment rate, inflation rate contribute only a few on the saving investment gap rather than the external factor, which is 64.80% that based on the abuse data that has been generated. So as for the recommendation of the future work is I'm really hoping that this technique should be used and should be practiced from now on, because these techniques can be used as the backup plan in order to survive when we facing the economic downturn or deficit later in the future. It's because that higher saving can help finance higher levels of investment and boost productivity over the long term. In economics, we say the level of saving equals to level of investment. Investment needs to be financed from saving. If people save more, it enables the banks to lend more to the firm for investment. So that's all for me. Thank you.